Two examples came to mind while you were talking about some of those things that leaders can do to build trust. And one was an example of a senior executive that I worked with on a project team who the project team was presenting a lot of technical information, and the senior leader was willing to say, "Hey guys, I understand this is really important, but I am not quite sure about what you're talking about. Can you break it down for me or make it more simple?" And to
Yeah.
be able to put your hand up and say that really models what we want to see in our teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Simon Sinek says, be willing to be the idiot, right?
Yes.
Willing to be the idiot in the room where you're like, hey, I don't understand this table.
Yeah.
And chances are you are not alone. And
Hmm.
even if you are alone, it conveys that, right? Like you're not too proud to ask for help. You don't have all the answers. And
Hmm.
you, right, there's a reason you're all together in the room. And so let's not cut down our ability to grow and to be successful in the work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that came to mind was like right at the beginning of COVID, I was working with a leader who um, worked in kind of a customer facing retail situation and didn't know how they were going to navigate all of the new requirements and safety protocols and shutdowns, and really for the first time they were able to say to their team, "I'm not sure how we're going to get through this, but we're going to get through it together." And showing that was so
Yeah,
important.
it's so powerful. Yeah, I lead a team. So I'm in the trenches doing this work every day. And I think that is such a lovely example. And I can think about many times in the last year where, I needed to make an important decision and it was right. It was my decision to make, but how you go about making that decision really matters. And so seeking collaboration, understanding concerns, saying, hey, these are as I understand it, these are the factors that we really need to pay attention to. What am I missing? Right. And
Mhm.
let's get to better solutions together.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. So, what can leaders do to rebuild trust if maybe it's been lost either between them and someone that reports to them or even within their team?
Yeah, absolutely. Because none of us show up on day one with trust figured out, right? And we're all kind of stumbling along our own path, and so inevitably, right, there are concerns that show up in this domain, and so I think what can be most powerful initially for a leader is to acknowledge the concern, right? Don't sweep it under the rug. Don't pretend that it will go away because chances are it won't. These sorts of things have a corrosive effect on teams. And part of what makes the trust issues more corrosive is when everyone's pretending it's not there, right? It is the classic elephant in the room that everyone is tiptoeing around, but they're not talking about it. And
Mhm.
so the willingness to actually talk about it, which can feel really scary, I think sometimes for teens and especially leaders, is a really important trust builder because basically it's saying, hey, we see these signposts on our path and we need to course correct. We're right, like we're not going to ignore it. We're going to pay attention to it. And that right there makes the team safer, that
Mhm.
acknowledgement. And so um, this really can be the single most important thing you can do if there is a concern. Obviously, when we're talking about a concern, we always need to protect individuals' privacy. So, right, if you had a situation where you had a team member come to you during your office hours and say, hey, I've got a concern with another individual, this is a situation, and you recognize like, okay, this is actually a team concern, right? Because if it's one-on-one, that is, if it's interpersonal, right, that's one thing. If it's more like, hey, this is really impeding the work, then it becomes a team concern. And so I think, communicating with the individual about, yeah, like I hear this concern, it's totally valid, we need to address this. How can we do that in a way that protects your privacy,
Mm.
right? And this conversation is really important because it helps build the trust with the individual who came to you with the concern, right? You're taking it seriously, and it gives them it gives them a sense of management of that situation to say, sometimes I've had experiences where the individual involved are like, oh, I'm ready to talk about it in team, right? And so like they don't really have concerns about privacy, and others really do have a lot of concern about privacy. So obviously you need to protect individuals' privacy, but we don't want to be sweeping things under the rug. I think another thing to pay attention to is to consider if system-wide changes are in order. Like, is this a pattern? Like, is this an ongoing concern? Have you had more than one person come to you over the years with this type of concern, right? And so there, I think it really does point us back to the leader in terms of, and the leadership team, right? That, okay, maybe we need to have a clear process. Maybe we need to have a clear metric. Maybe we need a code of ethics, or maybe we need to take a look at our code of ethics, or maybe we need to actually live to our code of ethics, right? So the work is around tying the organizational values, which hopefully you have, to the daily work more explicitly. And so if you notice that, oh, this is kind of a pattern, like this is not the first time this concern has come up, that's where, the work really centers on that leader and that leadership team in terms of processes and procedures. And then, when you're addressing a team issue, even an organization issue, depending on the size of the organization, really collaborating with the team and understanding their perspectives. Who is this a problem for, right? I mean, I try to ask that question all the time, because there can be an assumption that if I have a problem with something, it's a problem for everyone. And when you're the leader, that's often true, right? whether that's accurate or not, but really getting curious as a team and looking at, okay, what's the problem here? Like, do we all agree on what the concern is, right? And so that's really the top priority when you're having those conversations. And then I think you can get really curious and creative actually about, how do we solve this? How do we address this? And, depending on the size of the problem, like, you're not going to solve it in a day. You're not going to solve it in a month. You might not even solve it in a year. But as a team, to say, we're in this together, we're going to figure it out together. And I think breaking it down, like, what's the next step? What's the next the next point on that path that we're paying attention to? And then whenever you are creating or implementing some sort of change around psychological safety, you have to follow up. You have to keep communicating about it, not in terms of like, here we are talking about how we don't trust one another, but in terms of, this is where we're at on changing this process. Yeah. Right. And you're inviting questions, you're inviting concerns. So don't be afraid of what might feel like confrontation. Don't be afraid of those difficult conversations. And then I think the last thing is actually one of the most important. It's also one that gets overlooked, and that is focus on building positive connections on your team. Right. So if there's been a history of the criticism, if there's been a history of name calling or contempt among team members, right, focus on having positive connections, having fun, having time to banter, having time to shoot the bull. That is one of the things I think that's actually one of the biggest vulnerabilities for most organizations in this past year, is that, if they were used to working together in an office setting, you kind of have some of those built-in opportunities to just socially connect, right? There's, at the start of a meeting, in the hallway, in the break room, whatever. But with Zoom, right, like, people are getting on, they're, going through the meeting, and then they are out of there. Yeah. And so if you're working remote, my recommendation for that is, if you are leading that meeting, build in time at the beginning, right? And don't jump right in to the agenda, because first of all, no one's going to stick around at the end for connecting. But at the beginning of the meeting, right, that is a natural time to kind of connect. And so, sometimes it's, asking someone about, the picture on their wall, or, just inviting connection in those ways. And so it's not necessary to talk about the heavy concern all the time, right? Like, oh my gosh, like, I feel like I'm in therapy here. That's not what we're talking about. But we don't want to avoid the issue, but then we also want to build these opportunities for positive connection, right? And so John Gottman, again, the world's foremost researcher on couples and divorce, he says, even when there is a history, and here's the thing, right? What applies to couples also applies to us at work. So relationships are relationships are relationships. And what he has found in the research and his recommendation is even when there has been very contentious relations, right? Like there's contempt, there's criticism, it's a pretty hostile environment. This focus on just building positive connections can be a very powerful antidote. And what it does is it starts to sow these seeds of trust in the relationship. And so if that's happening on the team, right, you as a leader, you probably need to plan for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it an offsite, but an offsite that's not focused on the work, just
Mm-hmm.
having fun together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So good. So I think I heard a few things already in our last conversation, but and maybe I'll share a couple things that I've seen, but I wanted to ask you about what are some of the great things that trusting teams experience?
Yeah. So trusting teams, right? So that's where it's at. That's when people are able to do their best work and they have a lot of job satisfaction and life satisfaction, right? If we just think about for most of us, the hours of our life spent focused on work, it's such an important part of our life. And so we don't want to underestimate how important it is to really cultivate those great connections because I mean, I think about the team that I'm a part of. I'm like, they're my family. They're not even my work family. Like they're my family, and there's a lot of beauty to that.
Mhm.
And so, what happens when we have great trusting teams, right? So we've already talked about more collaboration, more creativity, more success, right? If we think about the financial bottom line, but also success in terms of fulfilling potential, reaching potential, growing beyond maybe the first vision that you had as a team, as an individual, as an organization. So all of those things are really powerful. But the other things that we also see, and this comes from self-determination theory, right? So this was from Harlow and Deci in 1971. And then these findings have been replicated. Daniel Pink talks about this in his great book, Drive. But
Mm.
when we have great trusting teams, right, with good leadership, which is a given, right? Like if you have a really high functioning team, you usually always have great leadership, right? They go hand
Right.
in hand. But the three keys of self determination theory is that your team members have autonomy, right? So we all have a need to guide our own life, to not
Mhm.
feel like we are rats in a maze. And
Mhm.
so if you think about how you can have autonomy at work, and this is really where we go back to this idea of let them know what needs to happen, but do not tell them how.
Mhm.
Let them forge their path. So trusting teams who aren't micromanaged, who can have a say in how the work should unfold, and feeling tied to that process have more autonomy, right? They have more satisfaction. They're happier. They're more invested in their loyalty to the organization. So autonomy is the first one. The second one is mastery, right? So when
Mhm.
we have a trusting team, we cultivate mastery. We cultivate growth, right? And so we think about mastery as this desire to improve, right? And so when you have a problem, right? If we think about a team member, they have a problem in front of them and they have the freedom and the flexibility to tackle that problem in a way that makes sense to them or requires them to grow or challenge themselves, they will be more satisfied, right? And
Mhm.
you can see clearly how that increases the creativity of the whole team. So Daniel Pink talks about 10% time, where maybe folks can have 10% of their dedicated work time to a pet project, right? We know that's been very successful for Google over the years. And so the second
Mhm.
real benefit after autonomy is mastery, right? So your team gets better. I mean,
Mm.
that's what it's all about. And then the third one, which is something I'm always passionate about talking about, is purpose. People have a stronger sense of purpose, right? So when they can see how their work impacts the organization, how their work connects them to the vision of the organization, they are more satisfied, they're happier, they are much larger contributors to the work, right? One of the most famous studies on this is when, there was a large hospital system and there was a new CEO on board walking around, the hospital floors and asking, meeting team members and asking, really, this was the question, what is your role? What do you do for the organization, right? Which can just seem like such a basic question, right? Like this individual is just trying to get to know people, and coming across several of the cleaning staff, right? So janitor staff, which typically, right, if we look at the research, they typically have pretty low job satisfaction. They feel disconnected from the work. And asking some of these great staff members, what's your role here? What do you do? They didn't say they're a janitor. They didn't say, which, right, like total respect for that work. But they said, I'm helping people recover from cancer. I'm right. They were so tied to the purpose and the vision that there wasn't this hard split between their work in cleaning a room and making a beautiful and comfortable environment. There wasn't a hard split for them between their work and what the oncologists were doing, what the
Mhm.
nurses were doing, and that is one of the most powerful things. One of the most powerful results that you get on trusting teams is people are united on that purpose. They really truly are a team. There's collaboration. There's a recognition that your work is just as important as my work, and we're all focused on the same vision. So pretty powerful.
It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we've had a jam-packed session today, but I like to close with a few rapid fire questions if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what do you think is the most important thing for leaders to know or do right now?
Yeah. That's a good question. So um, especially in times of uncertainty, it's always important, but especially in times of uncertainty, I would say the single most important thing that a leader can know or do right now is to have clarity about what matters and why, and then to communicate that transparently and often, way more often than you think you need to your team, especially in
Mhm.
uncertain times, right? People are working from home, they're more disconnected, and so it's not too much of a stretch to say, and I say this to everyone I work with, and when I'm speaking with folks, is in every conversation with your team, you should be connecting the work to purpose. You
Yeah.
should be connecting the work and the challenges to why it matters, because that's what keeps people going through the challenging times. And so that I think is the most important thing.
Thank you. So I think self-care is an important thing right now for all of us. So what self-care practice is currently bringing you balance?
Yeah. So I'm also kind of a zealot about self-care. Um, I, I, I've got to choose two. So my first one is journaling. I journal every single day. And what I find is I don't know what I think until I've journaled. So it becomes a way for me to process and make sense of what's happening in my life. And whether that is, sometimes I'm journaling strategically, right? Like I'm looking at strategic questions in my organization, and sometimes I'm processing my emotions and the stress and the overwhelm that is part of being a leader. And so that's super helpful. The other thing I do every single day is I take a nap. So I take a 20-minute nap every single afternoon. And it is a game changer. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's great. I think Ariana Huffington talks so much about
Yes.
the importance of sleep and rest. So
Yeah.
that's a
She's got a
great
great,
self care
great book on that
practice.
topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, I find that there are so many either leadership or personal development books that are on my list that I'd love to read, and I simply just don't have the time to consume them all. So I'm asking everybody, what's one resource that you're currently digging into? And if you could give us one key learning or a Cole's Note version of what the premise is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I am a total geek when it comes to reading. So you can also once a month I do a book club review. So if you listen to my podcast, I'll give you some book recommendations. I review a new one every month. But one of the recent ones, and I actually did do a book review on this, but a new one that I recently read that I think is powerful and especially important right now with the challenges that we're facing is Think Again by Adam Grant. And
Mm,
it's phenomenal. And I think one of the key, I mean, there's a lot of great things in that. But I think one of the most profound takeaways for me, or the most helpful takeaways, is that most of us are inclined to cling tightly to our beliefs and our opinions. And we've been taught that there's a lot of value in that, right? I mean, I think about the messaging from my parents. And yet, when we cling really tightly to our beliefs and opinions, it prevents us from having an open mind, right? It prevents us from learning. It prevents us from understanding another's perspective. And I think if we just look at the last year, with COVID, with other concerns, lots of concerns, we have become so polarized. And I think part of the reason is because we are clinging so tightly to our opinions and beliefs and this assumption that we're correct. And
mm.
Adam Grant makes a really good case for why that's probably not true. And some of the smartest among us have some of the biggest blind spots because,
Mhm.
quick example, they can, if you're more intelligent, you can identify patterns more quickly. And so you're much more likely to stereotype.
Mm.
Um, and so really disastrous when we think about trust, when we think about relationships. And so instead of clinging tightly to our beliefs and our opinions, right? So thinking about holding those lightly, be grounded in your values. Be
Mhm.
grounded in what are, 1 to 2 core values that can really be that guiding path through
Mhm.
life. Because, right, the world changes, right? We update best practices all the time. And if we're stuck on our beliefs and opinions, we're going to be left behind. And we're not going to be pleasant to be around. Like people just will not want to be with us. And yet, values really ground us in what's most important to us, but it also gives us the flexibility to be open to growth. It gives us the flexibility to learn from others, to understand the perspective of another. You may not agree with the other person at the end of that conversation, but you can stay firmly grounded in your values while learning to respect and appreciate maybe an opinion or a belief that is very different from yours. And I just think that message is so incredibly important right now. And in many ways, I think um, it could heal a lot
Mhm.
of the wounds that we're dealing with.
Yeah, so wise. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Well, I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts and resources on building trust. And thanks again.
yeah. Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it.